Here we go. It's time to get into some of the really fun years in this series. Obviously, I've enjoyed doing this series up to this point, and I'm still enjoying it, but this is a year that I've been really looking forward to getting into, and I'm sure a lot of people will probably, I hope, be excited to see me talk about this year if you're a gamer. Because sure, I'm excited to talk about video games no matter the year, but some years are obviously better than others, and this one, we've got a really good one on our hands. So I'm not going to dilly-dally here because the intro section will probably be pretty long for this one, so welcome back to I Want to Talk About, the series where I take a topic, I sit on camera, and I blabber about it. And as you can tell from the title today, I want to talk about my favorite games of 2001. You know how these videos work at this point. I get into a bit of an introduction about what that year looked like for gaming. I talk about some great games that I didn't play, or some beloved games that I didn't play, some just missed the cut games that I probably would have given like a 7 out of 10 to on a 0 to 10 scale, the cream before the crop, which is the 8 and 9 out of 10 games that I really enjoyed but weren't like my all-time favorites, and then my list of 10 out of 10 games. And this time around we have multiple to talk about, so that's going to be pretty fun. So, 2001, a year that was difficult in the real world for obvious reasons that I'm not going to get into, but you know the elephant in the room already. I'm sure it was not an easy year for many people. I'm sure there were certain events that obviously are very difficult to look back on from 2001. But in years where maybe the world is a little bit bad, some people will turn to different forms of entertainment for solace. People will turn to music, they'll turn to movies. Yes, they will watch movies. That is a real thing, movies. I don't know what it is, but it's a thing. But yeah, people will turn to music, movies, TV, something like that to find some solace in a world that's pretty fucked up. And video gaming was a pretty incredible place for solace at the time, because 2001, in the video game landscape, many people actually look at as one of the most incredible and maybe important years in video game history. And honestly, I can't disagree. I mean, between games that I will and will not be talking about too deeply in this video, we had some truly incredible and massively influential titles coming out in 2001, and it was a pretty stacked year. And beyond the software, it was an incredible year on the hardware front as well, with a lot of big releases of new systems. That's why this intro part's gonna be long, because in terms of checking up on the big console manufacturers in 2001, we got a lot to talk about. The only company that didn't have anything new related to hardware in 2001 was Sony, but that's just because they got a jump start with the PlayStation 2 by releasing it in 2000. Even so, PS2 sales, which had already started hot, exploded in 2001 because the system started to receive a lot of its big, heavy-hitting games in 2001. I mentioned it in the last video that the launch lineup, while kind of debatable, in my opinion wasn't super exciting, but in 2001, we started to see some of the really big titles start to take form and release on the PS2. Obviously, we'll discuss several of them in the video later on, but the first year proved to be uber successful for the PS2 with the sheer number of excellent games available for it. Hell, even the PS1 was still selling in decent amounts, and it would continue to sell pretty well over the next few years. By the time it reached the vaunted, very rare 100 million units sold mark, it was 2005. The year before the PlayStation 3 came out, that the PS1 got to 100 million units sold. That's pretty damn asinine to think about. PlayStation was a real juggernaut in the 2000s. On the flip side though, the same can't be said for Sega, and 2001 was their exit from the console market. In May, they officially announced that they would be discontinuing the Sega Dreamcast, which, quite frankly, really stood no chance against the PS2. I'll hand it to Sega. They really tried. And as I said in some of the last few videos, the Dreamcast was a pretty impressive console, but the odds were stacked against it from the start for a lot of different reasons, and then once the PS2 came along, yeah, no shot. Thus, the Dreamcast was just another in a long line of commercial failures for Sega that ended 18 years of hardware development for the company and forced them to basically become a third-party, software-only company to stay afloat. And obviously they survived. They're still one of the bigger third-party publishers to this day, but yeah, the Dreamcast had a pretty rough go-around. Even so, 2001 saw the release of 3 big new platforms, 2 of them coming from Nintendo. The first one that released in 2001 was the Game Boy Advance. This was the handheld that I really grew up on. I had owned the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color and all that stuff, but by the time I was actually old enough to game, the Game Boy Advance was out and about. And believe it or not, this was actually a very quick follow-up to the Game Boy Color. It dropped only 3 years after that system. It seemed like the reason it came out so quickly after the Game Boy Color was because while the Game Boy Color was kind of like a portable NES of sorts, the parts to create a portable SNES had just kind of come along pretty fast, and Nintendo was like, well, why wait? Let's just make the new one. Hell, this thing was technically pretty impressive at the time because it was actually capable of some forms of 3D graphical rendering, and it could outright emulate NES games proper, to the point where Nintendo had a whole lineup of NES games that they just straight up ported to it. Hell, you can probably thank this thing for being where Nintendo really started to see the value of re-releasing their games, because this thing, beyond that Classic NES series, had quite a few re-releases on it. Anyone remember the Super Mario Advance series? Though while this was a really good piece of hardware, chances are many of you probably have better memories with the Game Boy Advance SP revision that came out a couple years later. Because the original screen was so dark that you could barely see anything on it. It was like taking your Game Boy out into the outside world on a sunny day, except it was like that even if you were playing inside. The SP fixed that and actually gave players a screen where they could see what the hell was going on in front of them. And that was the version of the Game Boy Advance that I played the most as a kid, and yeah, I have plenty of fond memories with this thing. Largely from playing licensed games. Stop looking at me like that. I was 3 when the Game Boy Advance came out. Are you surprised that I liked licensed games so much? The Game Boy Advance was also not the only Nintendo system to launch in 2001, as I said earlier. In fact, the other one that came out in 2001, I actually have on my shirt right now, because it's by far one of my favorite systems. The GameCube came out in 2001. Alongside the PS2, like I said, one of my favorite systems of all time. And while it was Nintendo's worst selling console for a time, it's actually a system that's gotten a lot of retroactive love as of late. And quite frankly, why not? This thing really had a lot going for it. It was actually, on paper, more powerful than the PlayStation 2, which sounds wild to say given that modern Nintendo consoles kind of de-emphasize power a bit. It had an excellent first-party lineup that features, in my opinion, some of Nintendo's most creative and finest titles to date. The controller was freaking awesome. Nintendo still uses it on their modern platforms today for good reason. The system had a handle, and it was strong enough to survive a goddamn atom bomb explosion. Seriously, this thing was made of fucking powerful-ass material. Apparently there was a story that someone fended off a knife-wielding mugger because they used their GameCube to protect them from the knife-wielding mugger, and the GameCube made it out unscathed. Maybe instead of microchips, we should just start injecting people with Nintendo GameCubes. Unfortunately, sales were not super strong because of several different factors, including weaker third-party support, lack of multimedia and online functionality compared to its competitors, and Nintendo's inability to shed the whole "we are for kids" label at a time when gaming was starting to cater more to young adults. Apparently at the time, a lot of people were concerned that Nintendo was going to exit the console market. This despite the fact that GameCube, despite its weaker sales, was the only console on the market that was actually turning a profit for Nintendo. Every other system was being sold at a loss, so Nintendo was still kind of making out okay. But it was still a weird time, and many of its first-party games that I mentioned are super creative and fantastic were actually really polarizing to gamers back when they first came out. But nowadays, there's obviously a much greater fondness toward the GameCube, even though I kind of wish Nintendo would acknowledge that fondness a little bit more. Just re-release more GameCube games. Come on, do something. Just put them on the eShop or whatever. I don't know, maybe I'd actually want to subscribe to Switch Online if it actually had GameCube games. And there was also another new competitor in the console market in 2001, and that was Microsoft with the launch of their brand new Xbox console. Believe it or not, Microsoft had already kind of helped Sega with the Dreamcast, and the Xbox would kind of just like slide in and take the Dreamcast spot in the console market. Hell, given its kind of similar design philosophies and the fact that several sequels to Dreamcast games showed up on the Xbox, many kind of see the Xbox original as a sort of spiritual successor to the Dreamcast. Hell, much like the Dreamcast, the Xbox was also very significant for having, up to that point, the deepest integration of online gaming on a console yet. The console was built with broadband internet connectivity in mind, and Xbox became the first to monetize such a thing with Xbox Live, charging gamers a monthly fee for online services. And yeah, we can hurtle till the cows come home about how much we hate having to pay for online services in gaming, but at the time, Xbox doing something like that helped them to actually emerge as a genuine competitor in the console market. The online play helped the Xbox to stand out in comparison to its competitors. It also helped that the Xbox was pretty powerful, being built off of architecture and components that were actually closer to PC parts. It was one of the first consoles to really be closer to a PC as far as hardware is concerned. I know I was talking about the GameCube's power earlier, but the Xbox actually topped it and was pretty much the most powerful console on the market. And no, third-party games didn't quite show this because many of them were built with the PS2 in mind, but yeah, it was still a pretty powerful machine for its time. That said, it didn't really hit super hard as far as sales, as while it outsold the GameCube, Microsoft's use of super expensive components meant that they never saw a profit on even a single Xbox unit. Apparently, they lost $4 billion on the OG Xbox alone, hence why they had to resort to price gouging methods like Xbox Live to help them turn a profit in the wake of the console selling at such a loss. And yeah, Microsoft has definitely had its share of boneheaded moves over the years that we'll talk about in due time across this series. But if the original Xbox did nothing else, it showed at the time that there was room for a third console on the market alongside Nintendo and Sony, and Xbox has remained a competitor in that market to this day, even if their moves make me scratch my head more times than they don't. Hey, what are you gonna do? So yeah, long intro, I know, but it was a pretty significant time for gaming, so I wanted to catch you guys up to speed. But now we can actually talk about the games, because there were some really good ones from 2001, some of which I didn't even play. Again, in these videos I like to talk about some snubs, some noteworthy games that I didn't get to play in a given year, and 2001, there were some wildly significant games that I don't really have too deep of an opinion on. Looking at the 4 notable snubs that I have listed here, some of the big games from 2001 that I can't really talk about in this video include Grand Theft Auto 3, which I never really played, Metal Gear Solid 2, because I just personally have never really been hugely into Metal Gear Solid, I'm sorry. Eco was a pretty big one, but I just personally was not that crazy about the game. Oh, and Jak and Daxter came out in 2001. And even though I love platformers, and I love Sony platformers, Jak and Daxter never really did anything for me. Of course, I'd love to see the series come back, maybe it'll be better now, but trying to go back to the original game, I just wasn't all that crazy about it. But don't worry, we'll talk about some Sony platformers in later videos in this series. Hell, we're going to talk about a platformer now because there is one game in the just missed the cut section of 7 out of 10 games from 2001 that didn't quite make either of my lists, but I still think it's pretty good. A game that some people might be surprised isn't on one of my proper lists just because this game is pretty beloved and has quite a cult following. I didn't love it as much as everyone else, but I do still enjoy it. That game is Klonoa 2 Lunatea's Veil. Again, Klonoa is a pretty beloved cult 2.5D platformer, but I personally wasn't too interested in the first game when I did play it. Klonoa 2, meanwhile, was if nothing else a decent improvement, though I'll still say it didn't really blow me away any more than many of the other 2.5D platformers that I've played in my life. I personally wouldn't put it on the same level that some others have, and I don't think it reinvents the wheel or anything like that, but it's a cute, fun little 2.5D platformer for the young at heart. And hey, the game is available on modern platforms now thanks to the Fantasy Reverie series collection, so if you're interested, you can give it a look there. But now on to the proper first of the 2 lists, the cream before the crop. Games that I would personally consider to be an 8 or 9 out of 10. I go there because to me an 8 out of 10 is a game that I consider great. So these are the games that I consider to be great, even if they're not my all-time favorites. We've got about 5 here, I believe, so let's just jump right in. Finally, a video where I get to talk in earnest about Mario Kart. And it's gonna be the last one for a while. Yeah, as it is, Mario Kart is a franchise I took a pretty long time to come around on. I've owned several Mario Kart games in my life, but I didn't really become a huge Mario Kart lover until around Mario Kart 7. With that said, Mario Kart Super Circuit on the Game Boy Advance was my first Mario Kart game as a kid, and it was one I dumped a lot of hours into. It was honestly a rather impressive game for its time, being that it was kind of like a remake of sorts of Super Mario Kart with the graphical style of Mario Kart 64, and the fact that they were able to squish that onto a portable platform was honestly pretty impressive at the time. Plus, while it's not as deep or content-packed as other entries in the series, there's beauty and simplicity, and the game still managed to be extremely charming to this day. Given what we have of Mario Kart now, especially in a portable context, going back to a game like this might be a little bit moot if you haven't played it already, but it's still a charming and fun Mario Kart game that I personally love to go back to. What started as one of several stillborn prototypes for Resident Evil 4 before becoming perhaps one of the most impactful games to come out in 2001, Devil May Cry is essentially the granddaddy of the 3D character action hack and slash genre, and it's fair to say that a good deal of other action-based games have this to thank for paving the way toward their existence. And to this day, it's still an incredibly fun game to play. The gothic-themed aesthetic and the stylish, compelling combat and action still make this a blast even now after so many years. Yes, of course, there are a few elements of the game that age has not been so kind to, like the camera, and it is still incredibly easy to make fun of the voice acting in the game. I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light! But it's still a damn fun and highly influential action game that's worth going back to for more than just the history. If you haven't played Devil May Cry yet, definitely give it a look, and it is readily accessible on current platforms, so you definitely have more than a few ways to give the game a shot now if you haven't already. God, I love that we're going from talking about one of the most impactful and influential games of its given year to talking about a licensed tie-in to a Pixar movie. Only me, right? Yes, Matt the licensed game apologist returns to talk about another licensed game from my childhood that I probably enjoy way too much. This time, though, I don't have the disc because it's somewhere else in the house right now and I just don't feel like going to grab it. But someone would probably find it to be a little bit of a hot take that I actually like Monsters, Inc. Scream Team more than Toy Story 2 Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue. I know that sounds like a really wild take to a lot of people, but I do. Both are games I love going back to, don't get it twisted, but I do actually like this one a little bit better, weirdly enough. Like Toy Story 2, this is just a fun, sweet, accessible game that's good, lighthearted joy to return to. I've played and beaten it more times than I can count, and it's still a game I love to return to when I have time. Again, it's aged in some areas, but it's still a great time, and it's definitely my favorite of the licensed Pixar games that I've played. Again, if you're like me and you have a soft spot for these kind of games, this is one that's still worth looking into. You had to know that I couldn't go through a video on 2001 without talking about Halo. Quite frankly, there is no Xbox without Halo. As while Xbox has, in my opinion, always been behind the 8 ball when it comes to first-party titles, Halo has always been a great reason to have an Xbox. In some cases, I feel like it's the only reason to have an Xbox. I talked about how Devil May Cry was a quantum leap forward for action games, and Halo was just as big a leap, if not an even bigger leap, for the first-person shooter genre. Obviously, that genre was doing just fine throughout the 90s, but Halo really helped it jump forward even further, and again, it was basically the reason to own an Xbox back in the day. I never had an OG Xbox, so I had to learn about Halo through playing it on later consoles, but it is a franchise I quite like, and while some elements of Halo Combat Evolved have aged, it's still a great game. The grand, epic nature of it still remains compelling to this day, and it's a wonder how the game still plays so phenomenally even after all these years. The fluid controls and stellar action mixed with the still smart enemy AI makes for a campaign that's just as riveting as I'm sure it was to gamers 23 years ago. Wild to think it's been that long, huh? The level design can still be a bit sprawling and overwhelming to me at times, but it doesn't stop this from being a wonderful game that, in my opinion, everybody should experience. Especially if you're a fan of first-person shooters, I feel like you kind of owe it to yourself to at least give this game a try. And lastly, in our cream before the crop, I talked a good bit about Pikmin in my 2023 video, but I'm glad to say that I've finally come around to this franchise. For the longest time, I wasn't really able to get into Pikmin, specifically Pikmin 1, because I own the Wii re-release of it, and I could never get used to the motion controls. But after playing the Switch re-release last year, and being able to play it with a conventional controller, man, is Pikmin such a great game, and an incredible introduction to a Nintendo series that I think is pretty fantastic. I'll admit, I'm not even usually that big on a lot of real-time strategy games such as this, but Nintendo somehow took several gaming icks of mine, like mandatory time limits and a heavy emphasis on micromanagement, and turned them into gaming oohs of mine. The puzzles are compelling, the level design is unique, and the game manages to be challenging without becoming overwhelming, which I think makes it a great entry point for gamers who are not usually into RTS games. I also think the music is some of the best I've heard from Nintendo, and this is probably Nintendo's most morbid franchise, with minimalistic writing that still finds ways to be strangely existential. I know that sounds weird, but seriously, Pikmin can be really strange. But it's a really special game, and I'm happy that the recent Switch re-release helped me to really come around on it and see it for the great game that it is. If you haven't played the game, I definitely recommend checking out Pikmin 1 with its Switch re-release. And then check out the other Pikmin games, because they're great too. Well, Pikmin 2, maybe not so much, but it's still a pretty good game. Just check out the Pikmin series. It's fun. But now we're on to the proper best list. The 10 out of 10 games from 2001. We have 3 here to talk about, and they're all Nintendo games. I promise I'm not biased, I just like Nintendo games. But let's not waste any more time and let's jump into the proper list, starting at the number 3 spot. Now, even though the Nintendo 64 was going down in 2001 as everyone was preparing for the release of the Dolphin or the GameCube, whatever you want to call it. The Dolphin was the code name. Nintendo still had one or two tricks up its sleeve on the Nintendo 64, and the big one, for me, was Paper Mario. I'm not usually too big into turn-based RPGs, but my god do I love me some old school Paper Mario. The idea of a Super Mario RPG follow-up without the help of Square, where all the characters are made of paper, sounds like the kind of bizarro thing that only Nintendo could think up, but it works out so well. The game is just so loaded with charm and heart, from its colorful and beautiful visuals to the humorous storyline and characters, to the cheery, adorable music that plays all throughout. The worlds are also great to explore, and again, as someone who's not too into a lot of turn-based games, the battle system here is compelling and easy to get into, and it never lost my interest throughout. The partner system was also great, and it was awesome to see just how well everyone was utilized throughout the game. It really felt like every partner was important to the game at different sections. Obviously, like many, I still think that the Thousand Year Door is the best entry in the series, but the OG Paper Mario is a damn close second, and it's still a fantastic game across the board. Another one that I feel like everyone should try out. Also, I've said it many times, but I'm so excited to play the Thousand Year Door remake. I'm so happy that it's so close. We've only got like a month to go, and I'm pumped. I can't wait to jump back into it. At number 2, a big GameCube launch game that I think has kind of fallen under the radar at different points, but I think it's still fantastic in and of itself. Luigi's Mansion. I actually just recently replayed Luigi's Mansion for the 3rd time this past October as a festive spooky season game. Halloween is my favorite holiday, and playing a spooky themed game around Halloween is becoming a new tradition of mine now that I don't have a backlog anymore. And yeah, Luigi's Mansion remains one of the most fun and memorable games that I have played, and a game that I always love to go back to. I've always said that I think this game went a touch underrated, probably on account of it being a launch game for the GameCube and people expecting a 3D Mario platformer, not a game where Luigi vacuums up a ghost house. But damn, is it fun to vacuum up a ghost house. The gameplay of this game is so unique and addicting, and it once again shows how Nintendo is supremely good at just taking these ideas that make you tilt your head to the side and turning them into magic. The storyline is plenty charming and humorous, and they really nailed the atmosphere as well. The mansion is such an amazing location to explore, and the many ghosts that Luigi faces off against are absolutely awesome. Some of the boss battles in this are super epic. This is a perfect comfort game for me to go back to, and it's definitely an all-time favorite of mine from Nintendo. And it makes me happy to see that the franchise has gotten a little more love as of late, especially with the release of Luigi's Mansion 3. But there is still one game that will top Luigi's Mansion, and quite frankly, if you know me at all, you know what I'm about to tell you. I don't even need to hold you on this one. I feel like most of you probably saw it coming a mile away, maybe even 100 miles away, maybe even 1,000,000 miles away. I don't even need to build it up anymore. My favorite game of 2001, how could it be anything other than Super Smash Bros. Melee? You guys were probably screaming because you already knew that I was going to put this at number 1. Anyone who knows me, like I said, could have seen this coming from 1,000,000 miles away. Melee is the game I've probably put the most time into in my life, and even if it no longer holds the spot of my number 1 favorite video game, or hell, even my number 1 favorite Smash game, believe it or not, the sheer impact that this game has had on me is to the trillionth power of almost any game that came before it and would come after it. This game has basically been my life at various points, and it would take at least a decade for any game to come along and even rival the sheer amount of hours that I've put into Melee. It's just one of those games that never gets dull to me. The fun, fast-paced fighting mechanics are still incredible to this day. The visual design is just as charming as ever. The sheer amount of content is still breathtaking, even as other Smash games have come along and topped it or put more content in. And the insanely technical nature of it makes it even more fun. Beyond how much I've played the game, I've also spent plenty of time watching it played in tournaments. And while I haven't really been keeping up with the tournament scene quite as much lately, I can't pretend it didn't have a hold on my life for a good portion of time in the mid to late 2010s. And I also can't pretend I haven't watched the Smash Brothers documentary several times over. Seriously, go check that out. I have a picture of it on screen here, but the Smash Brothers documentary is really compelling, and I highly recommend you check it out for yourself if you haven't already. But Melee is an incredibly fun game to play and an incredibly fun game to watch, and if there's one game in my life that I can say I pulled the eat, sleep, and breathe lifestyle toward, it's Melee. It's left an indelible impact on me as a gamer and as a person, and even if it's no longer my all-time favorite video game, that level of impact and importance is something few, if any games can ever truly match. Long live Melee. So yeah, that's 2001. Really impressive year. Obviously, as I said at the beginning of the video, a year that many see as one of the most important and influential years in gaming. And yeah, there were a lot of incredible games in 2001. And obviously you could tell by all that I just said about Melee, but yeah, 2001 also gave me probably the most important game in my life, so that's worth something. And wouldn't you know it, 2002 might be just as stacked, if not more stacked. At least from the list that I've made here of the games I'll talk about in the next video, we've got some really incredible ones to talk about in 2002. Quite frankly, there are very few years coming up that I'm not looking forward to talking about. If anything, I think I'm looking forward to talking about them all. Though maybe that's just because I could talk about video games for hours if you gave me the opportunity. Nevertheless, these are all just my opinions on 2001 as a year in gaming. What did you guys think? Do you think 2001 is as influential and important as everyone makes it out to be? Are you not as crazy about 2001? What are your favorite games from 2001, whether I talk about them in this video or not? And since a lot of the topic of this video was the new consoles of the 6th generation, what were you when you were younger? Were you team PS2, GameCube, Xbox? Were you already gaming on a PC, so you were already better than everyone else? Were you someone who had a Dreamcast? For me, I was PS2 and GameCube, and I don't know which one I'd lean more toward. I love them both. But what about you guys? Where did you land in the 6th generation battle? Whatever your thoughts, opinions, experiences, and stories are, leave them down in the comments below. Let's keep this civil and have some fun as we like to do. If you guys want to hit like and subscribe and support some of my other ventures that I have linked in the description, thank you. If not, it's no big deal. I totally understand. And like I said, next video, I'll be talking about 2002 in gaming. Much like this video, I'm really looking forward to that because we've got some really fun games to discuss in that video, with probably a much shorter intro because I won't be going into too much depth on the releases of new consoles in 2002 since there weren't any. So stay tuned for that, but until then, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.